right, well, I'll go ahead and get started. So my name is Lisa. I'm one of the owners of Leaps and Bounds. We're a pediatric therapy center, and do quite a bit of feeding. And so feeding falls into the realm of occupational therapy because it's one of the occupations we have. It's one of the occupations that kids have many times a day, right? There's not just 3 meals. They're snacking all the time. So they are eating throughout the day. So early on in my career, I started getting kids on my caseload that were feeding kids, and they didn't teach us any of that in school. So I started doing a lot of continuing ed, and so over the course of the time that I've been treating, we've sort of developed lots of different strategies. So I think this is an opportunity to kind of share those, and hopefully we can brainstorm together to kind of help you guys through some of your feeding struggles. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that you guys can see this presentation. All right. I decided to call it Food Wars because it feels like that sometimes, right? It feels like a war, a battle that you're going into every mealtime. Oh, there we go. Okay, so really in this talk, so my plan is that I'll talk and I'll kind of share some of the information that that we talk about a lot at Leaps and Bounds and some of the things that I've learned along the way. But it is totally fine if you guys want to throw a question in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself. I mean, this is not structured at all. Just my presentation is structured, but feel free to jump in whenever. So really, objectives are to kind of help people increase their understanding of sensory processing as it relates to feeding, be thinking about some of the different factors that go into feeding, and then we'll talk about some of the common issues that we're seeing, figure out the difference between picky eaters and problem eaters. And then we're going to work on brainstorming some ideas. I've got some ideas in the presentation, but we can talk throughout about some other ones too. And I just thought this was a funny meme, right? Like there's so often times when you're like, I know that you will like this if you just try it, right? And they're not trying anything. Okay. So we talk a lot about sensory processing, and it can have a big impact on some kids, a little impact on others, but really the idea of sensory processing is that it is about taking in that information. We have to see the food, taste the food, feel the food. It's all of those different things. And then our brain makes sense of it, and then our bodies produce a response. But feeding is such a sensory activity, so there's so much involved in it. And it also has a really close link to emotion. And so if you have a child that has any sort of sensory difficulties, they're certainly more prone to having some feeding difficulties as well. So if I have a child that doesn't like the way things feel, then it makes sense that they might not like the way that things feel in their mouth or in their hands. If I have a child that is overstimulated visually, then when they see, I had a little guy today actually that I had some refried beans that we were going to put on a tortilla with some cheese. And as soon as he saw the beans, no beans, but it was a visual response for him. He has not tasted them before. But for so many of our kids, it is important to think about those different sensory experiences and how those are impacting the food that they're eating. Not to mention too, our smell, our olfactory sense. So, so many times we're rushing and we're microwaving things, or we're eating things on the go, and there's not that time to have food cooking and have that smell going throughout the house. And so it's just another thing to think about when you're thinking about food and feeding times. So there are lots of factors that go. We're rushing and we're eating things on the go. I think I can hear. Is it the YouTube thing? Cooking and have that smell going throughout the house.
I can hear it too, Lisa, but I couldn't hear it before. You popped on.
To think about thinking about food. I don't know.
So there are lots of factors.
Okay, we'll give it a try. Anyway, so there's lots of factors that go into feeding. And sometimes when we're in the midst of it, you're just thinking about just eat the food. Like, why are we have to why do we have to think about all these factors? But for some kids, when I'm looking at a child in a therapy center, I'm looking at, what is their age and are they developmentally ready for some of the foods? So we have kids that have, maybe we've got kids that are a little bit older, but they've sort of skipped some progressions. Like, it's fairly common for kids that are picky eaters to do stage 1 foods and do fine in baby foods. And then when they shift to stage 2 or 3, and they get a little chunkier, then they sort of like backpedal and have some regression. And so when kids don't go through all those developmental steps and then we just jump to table foods, it doesn't help. There's just some gaps in their oral motor progress. So I'm looking at what is their age and what foods should they be doing, but then also, are they developmentally ready for those foods? Thinking about family eating habits, which are different for every family. I know for us, owning the business, either my husband's also an occupational therapist. So usually one of us is here into the evening. So we developed long ago that like breakfast was our meal together, so we always have breakfast together. But we just never have dinner together. And it would be nice, except for in coronavirus time, we did have some dinners together. So that was nice. But it's important to kind of to be thinking about that. What is our family eating routine? A lot of kids that struggle with feeding have difficulty, like they need that predictability and that routine to kind of get themselves ready. And we're guilty of it. Life is fast and you're rushing to soccer practice and gymnastics and different things. So just looking at those factors and seeing if those could possibly be impacting your child that's struggling. I'm also looking at oral motor skills, and that might not be something as a parent that you feel equipped to look at, but I want to look at that for every kiddo, because sometimes when they've been a picky eater for a long time and they've maybe chosen certain foods to eat, then maybe their oral motor skills were fine, but then now that they're avoiding certain textures and resistance of foods, we might see some difficulty there. Or maybe they struggled with a bottle early on. And so they maybe didn't develop their oral motor skills in the way that makes feeding as easy. I have a kiddo that I'm seeing now, and he is 9, really bright kid, really successful in lots of ways, but been has been a really picky eater. And so he's come in for that. And what we realized is he still has, in babies, when you touch the side of their mouth and they turn, so for either the breast or the bottle, that's a rooting reflex. And he still has that reflex. And so there's a lot of oral motor. He has trouble moving the food around in his mouth. So he avoids lots of food because it's hard. And it's not, for him, it's not an inability. Like, it's not that he doesn't want to try it, but he just avoids it because it's hard. And he also gags on food frequently because he can't move it around in his mouth in the same way. So we want to look at that as well. And maybe that's an issue and maybe it's not. We want to look at postural stability. We want to look at taste and texture preferences. Sometimes kids will it's frequent that I'll have kids that are doing like orange foods, like mac and cheese and chicken nuggets, maybe some hot dogs, some chips. They're doing foods that are generally pretty easy to eat, but maybe they are full of sodium. Maybe they're, so we are looking at all those taste and texture preferences, and taking a look at that in terms of oral motor also, and seeing if there's some patterns that we can find. And then I want to look at sensory processing and just how overall they're processing that sensory information during mealtime and before and after mealtime, and then behavioral considerations. So looking at the environment, thinking about where these meals are occurring. If they're occurring at home and that's where the issues are, then that's what we can kind of focus on. Um, and then are they, if your child's in school and they're struggling with having those successful meal times at school, then we're looking at why that's happening. So it is good to kind of think like, okay, do we have the TV on during mealtime? Is the child more, sometimes kids are more successful with the TV on because they sort of zone out and just put food in their mouth. It's not the great end goal, but sometimes that is easier for kids. So you want to think like, what's going on? Who's there during the meals? What is that noise level like? Are there other kids that are picky eaters in your house also? Is it elevating everybody else? Are there certain smells or certain visual stimuli? And then what does the seating and positioning look like too? So it seems like a little thing, the seating and positioning. But for some of our little kids, like when they move from the high chair and then a booster, a lot of times their feet can kind of rest on the chair even when they're on the booster. And then when they move away from that, they don't have a real stable base to kind of to sit on. So a lot of times they're on their knees or kind of slouched down. So those are some things that we might take a look at too. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of those different aspects, but let's kind of put it into some different categories. So aspects of feeding, motor, and we're looking at oral motor. So the range that how their lips are moving, how their jaw is moving, how their tongue is moving food around in their mouth. Can they isolate their jaw from their tongue? And can they motor plan all of those different moves? What's kind of different about feeding than a lot of other skills is that we should have all the skills necessary by 2 to eat whatever foods are put in front of us. And then between 2 and 3, kids are refining those skills and making it so they're not quite as messy. But in many like in social skills, we keep developing those over time. So it becomes hard to catch up. But for feeding, that's we've got what we got at 2 years. And so between 2 and 3, they're just refining. So if you've got a kiddo that's older than that, it just takes some work to catch up, but they can catch up. So I like that aspect of feeding. Sensory. So how the food feels in and around their mouth, how those textures are, how they're interpreting those textures in and out around their mouth and also on their body. So many of our kids that have tactile difficulties also have feeding difficulties. And the feeding sometimes is the big thing because that's the thing that's happening all the time. You can cut out tags and you can, make things a little bit easier tactily, but the feeding pops out as, it's a daily living skill that they're working on all the time. We also want to look at reflex integration. Like I was telling you about this little kiddo that had that rooting reflex. So we want to look and see and make sure that all of their reflexes are integrated so that they can perform those oral motor movements that they need to. And then overall arousal, which is probably where a lot of our kids lie. So when feeding, we kind of talked about this a little bit before we started, but feeding is stressful. It can be stressful for the kid if they're not enjoying it, which makes it also stressful for the parent. And so then you have this interaction that that sometimes turns into a negative sort of space. And so and neither one is really helping the other, but it's just the nature of what happens with feeding. Feeding is one thing that kids can control, feeding and toileting, right? So so there tend to be a lot of control and behavioral issues around feeding also. So but early on, that bond between the parent and the child So whether you're breastfeeding or bottle feeding, there's a bond that's happening at that time. And if you have, sometimes we have kids that are great eaters as babies, and then they start struggling as they get table foods. And sometimes there's been a child that has struggled really the whole time with feeding. There've been issues with bottle feeding or breastfeeding, and then transitioning to baby foods, and it interrupts that bond for sure, and that makes it hard for parents. When you're stressed, when I'm stressed, you sort of stop being creative with your tools, and you just do what you can do to get by, and that also becomes hard in that situation, right? Um, I'm sure, I mean, me included, I'm sure that we've all said, you're not getting a cookie until you eat that broccoli, right? We've all said that. And then when the child doesn't eat the broccoli, you're like, and then they're melting down that they don't have the cookie. And then it turns into this whole big thing, right? So I'm hoping today we can talk about some other tools so that you don't feel like that's the only thing you have to go to. That is, it's just a if then, or when you do this, then you get this sort of situation. But like I said, it does give the child control. So and we try really hard. I think when kids are fighting for control of food, I like to try to give it to them, as long as, you have to guide that kind of carefully. But we want to find ways that we can give them that control and not make it such a battleground. And also, kids test the boundaries for sure. When they are there to kind of see, like, okay, is she really gonna not let me have this cookie? Um, I can remember we were at a family event, and my son was a toddler and doing that whole thing, not eating his food, and then you feel under the gun when you're around your parents or your grandparents too, and you feel more pressure to like make your kid behave, right? And so we were doing that whole thing, and I think I said, you can't have dessert. We were there for somebody's birthday. You can't have birthday cake until you eat. And then my son was running around, not following any sort of directions. And then afterwards, they're like, you're really not going to give him cake? And I'm like, yes, I'm not going to give him cake. But then I felt like a bad person because I was trying to make that stance, but it's hard. Okay, let's talk a little bit about picky eaters versus problem eaters. And you're probably thinking, okay, where's my kid fall in this continuum? This is just sort of a guide, but in general, picky eaters have about 30 foods, or a little bit more, but they have a decreased variety of foods. So I look at somewhere between 30 to 50 foods that they're eating, which sounds like a lot, but when you start naming all the foods, your kid might be eating more than it feels like on a day-to-day basis. Picky eaters will tolerate new foods on their plate. They might not eat it, but it's okay if the food is there. They can handle if the foods touch, typically. They might not like it, but they don't have a meltdown or gag or vomit about that. If they stop eating foods, so it's pretty typical that kids will have what we call these food jags. We try to prevent them, but some kids will be like all in, like hot dogs every day. That's all I want. And then they'll stop eating hot dogs altogether. But usually picky eaters will pick that food back up again in a few weeks. And then the other kind of characteristic of picky eaters is that they eat with the family, but they'll often eat a different set of foods. Anybody identify with any of that stuff? Yeah. Okay. And then problem eaters are even more restricted, so less than 20 foods. They might cry or fall apart when a new food is presented, or they may refuse all foods that share the same texture. Or they almost always eat foods that are different than the family. So, or gag or vomit when new foods are presented. I think I got that question ahead of time, but do some of you feel like you're fixing an entirely different meal for this one particular kiddo, or maybe you've got multiple picky eaters and you're fixing a few different meals?
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like that for sure. And that's hard. It's stressful as a parent. It is a lot of extra work. And even when you go to make the food and then the child is not happy with even a different kind of food, that becomes really stressful. Okay. Okay, so always the goal in feeding therapy is that that they're going to eat, right? That they will eat carrots and they will eat broccoli and they will eat meat and strawberries, and they'll eat the things that they're supposed to eat. But so much of beginning to work on that is really only about making mealtime a positive experience. Because if you feel at this moment like you sort of get your muscles tense up and you're like, okay, it's mealtime again, what is going to happen? Then and your kids are picking up on that too. You feel it, they feel it. So much of what we're working on is just coming to the table and it feeling positive. So that doesn't feel like it's getting us to the end goal, but really we just want to decrease all of that stress and anxiety around feeding. So that's often our first step. So steps to eating: tolerating the food in the same room, tolerating the food at the table, tolerating it on your plate, then interacting with it, then smelling it, touching it, tasting it, and then finally eating. And these steps, for therapy, we even break them down even farther into like 32 different steps, which seems crazy, but you can make a lot of progress and still not quite be eating the carrot, but we're working toward that goal. So I always tell parents, like, it's really important to celebrate the little baby steps. So maybe the child didn't eat the carrot today, but maybe they were okay and didn't have a huge negative reaction that the carrots were on the plate. Or maybe the child was able to sword fight with the carrot, or maybe the child was able to we do this all the time too, put the carrot in their mouth and then have like a lightsaber battle while they're holding the carrot. Although feeding is hard with COVID, we're really trying to be creative, but it's hard to do with COVID. So I think that it as a parent, it is about the feeding. You have to get that food in them, and you want for them to be healthy. But taking a step back and looking at how can I make this a more positive experience for all of us is an important step. Okay. So let's talk for just this. This is a lot of information, but I'm going to just kind of go over it a little bit. Okay. So, and this is just a guide. It's not like at exactly 7 months they should be doing X, Y, Z, but this just sort of gives you a guide. So 5 to 6 months, they're doing those thin baby food cereals that you start introducing. And so as you go through this gradation, you can see how some of the textures change and maybe where there might have been a breakdown for your child. And maybe it wasn't until table foods, but so around 5.5 to 6.5 months, you're thickening that baby food up a little bit. They're starting to do stage 1. And then they're at 6 to 7 months, they can handle a thinner baby food puree that kind of slides around in their mouth a little bit more. And then we're doing a thicker baby food puree after that. So they've got to move it around with their tongue. And then 8 to 9 months, soft mash table foods. So things like bananas that they can mash with their either their gums or their teeth or their hard palate. Then thicker baby food purees, and starting to think about stage 2s. And like I think I said before, but stage 2 tends to be, we tend to see some issues with stage 2. and then stage 3 as well. But it is where things start to get a little chunkier. And so you might have a kid that's spitting out those chunks, or maybe they're avoiding the food altogether because it is difficult for them. Um, Around 9 months, oh wait, here, let me go back to 8 to 9 months. Another thing that we like to work on is those, we call them hard munchables, but basically like maybe a whole carrot or a whole piece of celery, where they could get that in their mouth and they can kind of chomp down on it, but they're not going to get a bite out of it. But it's giving them a way to explore. Part of the reason that we incorporate those a lot is because so toys that babies put in their mouth used to be kind of long like that. They're no longer long because we are really conscious about choking and that kind of thing. So the things that babies put in their mouth, I mean, they could put whatever in their mouth, but the toys that are typically made for babies are, it's hard to get too far into their mouth. It's hard to even get to like that middle part of their mouth because we've changed and adapted that. So if you have a child, I mean, if you have a child that's sticking things in their mouth, they're doing that to kind of explore and get the feel of that, bring things from their hands to their mouth, which developmentally we want to see. Sometimes kids that are feeding kids, they're not the kids that are sticking things in their mouths all the time. So we want to try to introduce those kinds of foods so that they can do that exploring. And so we do that even if, so that is an 8 to 9 month old skill, but maybe I have a 6-year-old that is stuck in that pattern. And so we're doing some exploration so they can figure out how they move that food around in their mouth and what that feels like. And then 9 to 9.5 months, hard solids that melt. So like graham crackers or those Gerber puffs, those kinds of things that are just going to be, and they kind of stick everywhere. They stick to their hands and they stick to their face, but when they get it in their mouth, they'll just kind of melt in there. And then 10 months and 11 months, they're doing some of those soft foods that are cut into cubes. So they got to open their mouth a little bit wider and chomp down. And then around 12 months is when we usually start introducing stage 3 foods. So those are foods that are a little bit more consistent with what we might do for table foods. And then 15 to 18 months, hard chews, sticks of raw fruits and vegetables. So that might be like a apple slice or, or a carrot. And then 18 to 24 months, really 18 months to 36 months is refinement of skills. Did you guys have some, like thinking back, did some of your kids struggle with some of those changes of baby foods, or is this something that popped up more in like toddler area time?
Well, my toddler has always struggled since day one. I mean, he's only going to be 3 in November, but we've always had an issue there with feeding. And then I have a 15-month-old that eats everything, but now he's sort of turning into mutating into a toddler where he's throwing things on the floor, kind of throwing more fits. It's more of a behavioral thing, I think, because he loves food and eating. It just seems to be a different issue.
Yeah, I know it. I mean, a lot of times when you start thinking back, then some of this makes sense, and sometimes it pops up, and it may be more of a behavioral strategy that we can use. But it is good to kind of think back and go, okay, what are some of those? Are there specific foods that they're struggling with, or specific times? Okay. So here's some tips. So some things that you want to think about: avoiding what we call food jags. So the food jag is when they only want to eat one thing. They only want waffles, or they only want, hot dogs, or whatever it is. Because if they then drop that, then it's like the thing they're eating the most of, and then they drop it. And that's pretty typical for kids to go through those food jags. So one of the things that I recommend to parents is often that to prevent those as much as possible, I don't let kids have the same food 2 days in a row. So if you have a hot dog for lunch on Monday, you can have a hot dog again on Wednesday, but we're going to have something else on Tuesday. And so because otherwise it's so easy to get into those cycles where they're having the same kinds of things all the time. So so one thing that does happen with that is if you don't have enough foods to rotate in and out, then you've got a kid that is eating a whole lot on Monday and not eating as much on Tuesday. So we kind of want to work through that as well. But and we don't want to go through that for too long a period of time, but if we can add enough, I usually start doing that if they've have at least 20 different foods, so we can rotate that in. Letting kids play with their food and get messy is a really important part of feeding.
I have a quick question about
Yeah,
the 20 foods. Are you talking about like 20 individual items, like an apple, not necessarily meals,
yes,
just
yeah,
single items? Okay.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, and so I'm going to actually, now that you asked that, I'm going to jump down a little bit because so when you're thinking about meals, it is appropriate for kids. I know, I mean, my kids are a little bit older now, but I know when they were kids, I just felt like there were snacks happening all the time, right? There's like every minute they need a snack. But kids should really be having 5 to 6, I call them meals, 5 to 6 meals a day. But so we do like breakfast, lunch, dinner, but then also a couple of snacks in between there. But if you think about making even those snacks have a protein, a fruit or vegetable, and a carb. So maybe it's a few pretzels, some peanut butter, and a couple slices of banana. Now, I know, wouldn't it be ideal if the kids would eat that all the time? But thinking about making their snacks a little bit more solid like that, so there's some protein in there as well, is a kind of a goal that we try to set out. So it's not just that they're eating Cheez-Its or Teddy Grahams for a snack, because what happens with their blood sugars when they're eating those foods that are high in sugars without a protein, then it doesn't balance their blood sugar out. So then they have these like highs and lows of blood sugar. So we tend to get more behaviors with that kind of eating as well. So if we can get, even if it is a weird mix of foods, maybe it doesn't, I mean, I think pretzels, peanut butter, and a banana don't sound too weird together, but even if it's a strange mix, but you're getting in some protein in there, I think that's a good plan. So letting kids get messy. I think this often is a struggle for parents because life doesn't allow you lots of extra time to get messy, clean up the messy, do all the playing with food. But if you can set some time aside so that they get to interact with food in a manner when it's not just, hey, we've got to eat this and we've got to get this done, it helps to decrease that stress around feeding. Thinking about postural support. So if you have a child that their legs are just dangling, or there's not a good spot for them to sit. Like sometimes kids just can sit on their knees at the table and that works out okay. But it might be good to set them with some phone books underneath their feet, or a laundry basket tucked under their feet, so they've got something stable to push off of. And so thinking also about, it sounds easy. So just bring the kids to the table, they eat their food, and then they leave. That sounds like a good plan, but just knowing that they're bringing to the table possibly, different sensory strata or different sensory processing difficulties that they're struggling with, arousal level difficulties. Maybe things are visually overwhelming or auditory overwhelming. And so just knowing that is a difficult task. And so we can still leave the table. Maybe they didn't eat everything, but maybe we've made some progress on some of those steps. And then remember that you are modeling everything for the kids. And so I have this story where I was doing a feeding group one time, and I was talking with the parents, and another therapist was doing the feeding with the kids. And we had peas, I think, one day, and they were like smushing the peas. And the parent group, I was talking with the parents, and this one parent was like, "Oh my gosh, disgusting. I hate peas." And I was like, "Oh, wow, that was," I mean, we weren't even in the same room with the peas. And I was like, wow, that was a big reaction. I wonder if that's impacting your kiddo. And she's like, well, we don't eat peas at my house. I'm like, okay. But just knowing that how you approach foods, the words that you give things, that they are hearing and listening to that. So I try to do when we're doing feeding, I don't say, like, I try to say things like, oh, this tastes really salty, or this is sweet, or this is a big flavor. And I don't try to say, oh, I don't think you're going to like this one, or because sometimes we do that as a way just to protect our kids, right? Because you don't want to have a huge reaction. So just know that your reactions, they're watching what you're eating, and they're watching how you're reacting to that. Okay, so here's some ideas, and we can kind of, like I said, just if you've tried them and they've worked, or you've got other ideas, feel free to chime in. Okay, so think about being creative, using condiments to allow kids to dip their food in, ketchup, ranch, Nutella, and it feels sometimes like there are certain things that should go in ketchup and certain things that should not, right? But try to just be open with it. I had a session I did with a kiddo one time, and he had never had ham before, and he was an older kiddo, like maybe 9. And he said, I feel like I'm going to try ham tonight. And I was like, holy cow, what is, like, that came out of nowhere. And he goes, but I really want to dip it in Nutella. And I'm thinking, and I always eat what the kids eat with them, we like do this together. And I'm thinking, that's real odd, but I didn't want to share that with him because he was super excited about it. So I was like, oh, that sounds like a really interesting flavor. But he did it, and he ate ham dipped in Nutella. But before we went out and told mom, I ran out and I'm like, he did something, we're really excited about it, and you're really excited too. And so she was really excited that he ate ham, but it is sort of a strange combo, right? So if the kids have ideas, they're thinking, hey, I really like ketchup, maybe I could dip my broccoli in ketchup, then go for it, right? I mean, I know you guys are probably like, yeah, that sounds great. I would love my kid to dip broccoli in ketchup. But sometimes it's hard to like think outside the box. Okay. Other ideas. So cutting sandwiches, deli meat, or cheese with cookie cutters. So get them involved in that too. So you can buy at the deli, if you get deli sliced meat, you can buy it a little thicker and then cut it with the cookie cutters. And sometimes just doing something kind of different like that will be enough to intrigue them to want to check it out. Think about trying different intensities, such as so things that are like sour or spicy that you wouldn't maybe ordinarily think of. So we have some kids really, they have maybe a lower arousal level of food taste. And so when they have big flavors, kids sometimes are drawn to that. I've had kids that I wouldn't have thought would love spicy foods, and then they do. So think about changing some of those flavors up for your kids. Letting kids get really creative with combining foods. So this actually came from a session that I did. I had pepperoni out, and we had some goldfish crackers. So the pepperoni was not a food that this kid was eating. The goldfish were a food that they were eating. And so he's like, I wonder if I wrap it around, we could call it a fish taco. I'm like, we could totally call it a fish taco. So, and he ate the pepperoni that day, but it was his creation, not mine. So, I mean, it's good for you to be creative too, but if you've got kids that can buy into that, I think that's great. As much as you can, help them with planning or have them help with planning and cooking and grocery shopping and meal prep. I think sometimes that becomes not sometimes, a lot of times that becomes a lot of work to have them participate in that, but it's a really great opportunity for them to have some buy-in into the meal, and to get kind of excited about it. So that kind of thing can be really helpful. I should probably have stock in this because I talk about it all the time, but there's a program called Radish Kids. Have you guys heard of that before? So we got this a while ago, like it was a Christmas present for my kiddo. And what is really cool about Radish Kids is every month you get these different recipes and different like cooking utensils, and the recipes are all colored and laid out so the kids can really participate in it, instead of, a lot of times I'm doing a recipe off my phone, and it's hard to read through, and I've got to scroll up to find the ingredients, and but these are like really kid friendly recipes, and I use them a lot here, and the kids get really excited about it and will try different things because they've participated in the making of it. And then it's sort of like their monthly box that they get, so there's more buy-in there too. Okay, so some more ideas. Playing, lots of playing. So getting the kids even to kiss the food, we'll do that sometimes. Like I'll say, if I have a child that's even nervous or doesn't want to, that's gross, I don't want to have anything to do with it. Sometimes I'll say, well, I can kiss the broccoli, you can kiss it too. And even getting it to their lips is a success. So we want to celebrate that. Having the child get messy with the food and will help them to gain comfort and feel kind of excited about it. And I can't tell you how many times that I've had a kid that maybe it's pudding or yogurt or whatever, something messy that they're playing in that they normally wouldn't eat. And since it's all over their hands, there's just like the tongue comes out at one point, So sometimes just decreasing the demands, not having, so we're just going to play with this yogurt, and not making a demand that they have to eat it can then decrease that enough to where they actually take a bite. Pretend play, so making things, this type of thing I think we're pretty familiar with as parents, but like making cars out of carrot sticks, pretzel rods as drumsticks or lightsabers. Again, you're just making it fun, getting them involved and that imaginary play with it. And then this concept of food rockets is something we do a lot. I actually did it with a kiddo earlier. So we do it at cleanup time. So I'll have all the food that we've been playing with. And then when it's time to clean up, I'll bring the trash can over and we rocket the food into the trash can. So they'll put the carrot in their mouth and we'll go 1, 2, 3, and they spit it into the trash. So a lot of parents are like, what? You're teaching my kid to spit food? Like, I don't like that plan. But getting what it is it's making it fun. It's getting them to get the food in their mouth and spit it into the trash can. We have rules that the rockets can only go into the trash can or to a designated target of some sort. But then they're getting that taste when we originally couldn't get it in their mouth prior to that. Okay, we talked about this, but being a good model. So you want to eat the foods that you're expecting your child to eat. And I've had families that'll say like, my husband or my wife can't stand vegetables. And so we're asking the kids to do that, but one of the parents is not into, like, won't do vegetables. So it is, the kids are watching, right? So it is good to get everybody on board. Like, we're all doing this together so that the child can see that modeling. Avoid talking about how food tastes in a negative manner. So I don't ever say, I don't like that. I'll say things like, ooh, that is a big taste, or I like this better. But I don't say things like, I don't like that, it's yucky, or anything like that. Like for instance, if a child has a food that's too hot, I've had sometimes where kids are like, it's too hot, and they want to push it away. So then rather than doing that, I'll say, oh, mine is hot too. I can blow on it. You can blow on yours too. And so you're just teaching them to kind of work through that plan, but you're not approaching any of it in a negative manner. So using phrases like you just heard me say. So I never say in our feeding sessions, I never say, try this, take a bite, your turn, because it takes the control away from them, right? It puts a demand on them. So I'm just always inviting them to do it, and I'm sort of narrating what I am doing. So I can crunch this carrot. Look at it; it's super loud. Ready? I'm going to crunch it, and I talk about that, and then I'll say, you can crunch it too. And this sort of thing, it seems really subtle, but it is. You're just telling them that they can do it rather than asking them to do it. Does that kind of make sense? Like I said, it seems really subtle, but it is a big difference. This kiddo that I had today, he was really freaked out about the beans, I told you. And all I was kind of hoping that he would do was to spread the beans on the tortilla. And he was like, no beans, no beans. And I was like, oh, I can do it. You can do it. And we did that a couple times, and he's spreading the beans. He didn't look real happy about it, but he was spreading the beans on there. But he interacted with the beans rather than pulling way back in his chair. So that I can do it, you can do it is a really good strategy. Then lots of talking about the taste and the texture and the temperature. So a lot of times kids will just associate like, that's gross, I don't like it, or that's disgusting. So I might say like, tell me about what you're talking about. Does it taste salty to you? Is it squishy in your mouth? What is it that you don't like about it? And so that we're not just right away having a fast negative reaction, that you're kind of talking through that with them. It's kind of just a coping strategy for them. And talking with them about picking foods to try together. So maybe, maybe they're thinking about, maybe they want to do yellow foods one day, or they want to do purple foods, or they want to do foods that are crunchy, or they're really excited to try a certain kind of muffin, but they're helping you plan that. So it's not just something that you're telling them to do. Okay, lots of exploration with the food. So talking about what it looks like, what it feels like, how you could change it. So sometimes if I have a child that maybe it's a fruit or vegetable and they're not wanting to interact with it too much, but I can get out like a little knife for them, like a knife that's suitable for a kiddo. And we can cut it open. Oh, what does it look like inside? I wonder if it's soft. I wonder if it's juicy. Like, let's check it out. And so getting them to interact with it in that way. And so using that language that encourages them to explore it. Then the idea of a learning plate. A learning plate is, I only really use this if I have kids that can't tolerate food on their own plate. But if you have kids that like you're serving the meal that everyone's having and they cannot have that food in front of them, then I might offer a learning plate where I'll say, oh, if you don't want that on your plate, you can put it on the learning plate, and it's just for us to talk about. So maybe it's a carrot on the learning plate. And so it's not causing them so much stress because it's on their plate, but it's still on the table. We're still talking about it. But I don't jump to that unless I feel like a kid really needs that. Okay, so feeding and oral motor therapy, the goals are to increase awareness in around their mouth, to normalize if there's sensitivity, to work on the movements that are happening within their mouth, to differentiate oral motor movements, so to be able to move the jaw in a different movement than their tongue. Obviously to improve their feeding skills and their nutritional intake and increase the safety of feeding as well. So a lot of these things you guys can work on at home. but if you are still struggling, like when it might be a good idea to talk to a therapist or to seek some outside help. If you've got a child that's choking frequently or gagging or vomiting at meal times, that seems like a big one, right? That's obviously a time that it might be good to talk to somebody. If they have a history of eating or breathing coordination problems, um, if they are not able to accept table foods by 12 months, or if they're avoiding a whole specific texture or nutrition group, if they have less than 20 foods or right around 20 foods, if you have an infant that cries or arches during most feedings, if parents report that mealtime is stressful all the time, that might be a good time to get some help. Or if a baby's not weaned off baby foods by 16 months. Okay, so our goals are to give support to parents, to facilitate strategies for home and the community. And sometimes we'll do, like if we are doing feeding therapy here, sometimes we will we'll work on something specific here and we'll say, don't work on that at home yet. Let's give us a couple weeks to practice it. We want to set up some home programs to facilitate that progress at home, help make meal times a positive experience for all family members. That's sort of like our overall arching goal, that we want to create that positive mealtime experience, because it's hard. I mean, you just can't make progress when you're like in this fight or flight sort of state. So we want to calm that down first. Listen and acknowledge the stress that having a child that's not eating is difficult. And so we sort of want, not sort of, we want parents to know that they're not in it alone and that they can chat about it and talk to us about that. Provide support in any other areas that might be impacting feeding, and then provide any other resources or referrals to help that family reach their goals. Okay, so before we go, and I'm fine, I can stay and try to field some questions too, but I want to make sure that the questions I got ahead of time are answered. So if you have a child that doesn't eat and is like, and the strong will thing, so it feels like there's a battle of the wills. My first thought about that is to try to decrease that at all costs. So I don't think this means making separate meals. I think that it means, I always recommend having the same meals that the rest of your family is having, but giving them maybe a couple of, like, another separate option. So this is what we're having. I will also make you a small peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but not like an entire whole meal. But the expectation that they sit down with us and that we talk about it, play with it. Maybe they don't eat the spaghetti with red sauce, but they're participating in it. Because I think that the more you make it about the battle, the more the battle is going to happen. So we want to try to decrease that as much as possible. Another question I had: tips on how to get your child to try new foods, and why is it so hard to get the child to try if they're scared? So I always look at why is that happening? So I think that if we can, again, decrease that negativity around mealtime, like that stress that we're all feeling, and maybe do some opportunities during play where they can just explore. The expectation is that we're just going to play and explore and start to decrease some of that stress that they're feeling. Okay, and then the last question I had on here was want to learn more about how not to make separate meals for the kids. I know, and I would say that if you're doing that now, it's hard to do like just a total 180, like, okay, you're not doing separate meals anymore. But I would set up the expectation. Maybe we do what we call like a social story to kind of plan for it. Okay, so starting on this date, we are all going to eat the same meals. I will fix one extra, whatever it is, peanut butter and jelly sandwich, or you get 5 crackers and cheese or whatever. But the expectation is that they have that to lean on if they need it. But if we only make separate meals for them, they're only going to eat those separate meals. So we want to look at how can we wean them off of that in a way that makes sense. So I do think it should be planned. I don't think it should be a surprise. I think that so we want to prep them and different kids and different ages are going to be able to handle that differently. So I might do what we call a social story, where we talk through, kind of, we write a little story about how that's going to happen and what we're going to expect and what we're going to do. And we just keep reading that story for the next week until that day happens. And I would be prepared to have some meltdowns. That's going to happen for sure. I'm not under the belief that it's like you can only eat what we're having and there's no other options. Some feeding clinics will say, don't give them foods that they are used to, those foods that they go to all the time. And if they don't eat in 30 minutes, then they don't get another meal until a certain day or until a certain time. And I sort of understand that a little bit, but for some of our kids, especially if they're kids with sensory processing difficulties, they will just wait. They will just wait until there's something provided that they can eat. And so I think I want to be sensitive to that, because I don't think that strategy is a great overall strategy. But I really believe in prepping the kids and letting them know that what's going to be expected and providing them with something that's preferred for them, so they'll have that. And that'll decrease their stress around that too. So it's not just like they have to sit there for a meal where everything is super stressful. They have something available that they can eat, but they're also participating in the regular kind of meal time. I wouldn't pick those time if like dinner time is super stressful because you're trying to shove it down before you get to sports and homework and all of that. I don't think that that's the best time to probably work on that. Find times that are less stressful for everybody, where you can spend some time playing and interacting with the foods. Do you guys have some more? Here, let me back out of I'll stop this share and then we can see each other a little better. Do you have some other questions you want to talk about?
So Lisa, if you're saying like let them put the carrot in their mouth, or let them just put the carrot in their mouth, right? And celebrate the fact that they did that, right? Then maybe the next day might be like, let's try to take a bite of the carrot.
Yeah.
Like, are you just taking baby steps like that?
Yeah. And I'm always, it's so easy to try to be like, okay, they're touching it to their mouth. And then you want to be like, okay, now you can just take a bite. And it feels so easy to do that. But I think be really careful, because as soon as you put a demand on it, then it's like something that they can kind of push up against. So I just say things like, I'm going to take a bite. Let's listen to it crunch. I wonder if you can crunch yours louder than I can crunch mine. And you're sort of inviting them, but if they back away, then I don't push them on it. Does that kind of make sense?
It does. And when you're seeing your children and when they come to your facility, are you like focusing on like carrots? Like, do you revisit carrots next time? Like how, each day do we like stick with carrots, or do we say, okay, we practiced carrots yesterday, let's try like, I don't know, something else today? Like, what do you recommend on that?
I often, when I'm starting to work with kids, I will do the exact same foods each time. So I might have like 6 to 8 foods in our session. I might have 6 to 8 foods that I'm bringing out all the time. If I feel like it's causing the child more stress, if they're like, oh my gosh, the carrots are coming next, then I might switch that up. So because that's just the more exposure that they get. I also, so if you have kids that are really sciencey and into sort of understanding about science. There's research that says you have to try something 11 times before your brain can decide if you like it. So I like to like throw that out at the kids sometimes for my little scientists. I'll say, well, I know you're saying you don't like it, but we have to keep exploring it because your brain doesn't know that yet, you know. So we're gonna keep bringing it out and feeling it and touching it and learning about it so that your brain can make a decision, can make the best decision.
So I quickly made a list of the foods that my 2-year-old eats, and it's 15 foods. And a lot of those foods are just quickly dropping off because he eats them all the time. So it's like becoming this like high pressure situation where I'm like, okay, he's not eating anything at all. And now I'm getting super anxious and
Yeah.
it's making him super anxious. So I'm like, at this point, I think that we do need outside help for him. But is that something that I go through my pediatrician for, or how do you just go to a feeding clinic? How does that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great to talk to your pediatrician about it. I will say, depending on how you feel about your pediatrician, I think a lot of times what we hear as pediatricians are like, they'll be fine, they'll catch up. So I would also trust your gut. So I think it's great to talk to your doctor about that, but also trust your gut and know that. Like if it feels like it'll be okay, I think go with that. But if you're like in my gut, I feel like we need some additional help, I would push for that.
Yeah.
And if he's dropping, so it does sound like it's probably an important time if those he or she, I said he, but is it
He.
he?
It's a
If
he.
he already has a real limited amount of foods and he's dropping them, that's a scary time as a parent for sure.
It
Because
really, really is.
yeah, no, I get that for sure. Um, yeah, I'm happy to just sit down and meet with you if you want, and we can kind of talk through it a little bit. And he's just gonna be 3 now in November, you said?
Yeah, on Thanksgiving, actually.
Okay. So he wouldn't probably, so before 3, then you can sometimes get some help through first steps. But it feeding is sort of hit or miss in first steps. It just depends on how delayed they are with that. But since he is so close to 3, I don't know that I mean, that process might take a little bit of time anyway.
Yeah. It's frustrating because I cook every single meal 5 days a week. The only time I don't cook is on the weekends. And I have the kitchen helper stools. He makes every meal with me. He touches all of the foods, but he will not eat them. So
You're doing all the right things.
I'm trying, but it's like I'm not there at all. So
Well, and I will say that sometimes the parent and the child are there's too much of emotion tied to that. And so if
yeah,
you are at a point where you get some outside help and it's coming from outside the family, sometimes the child will respond differently because it's like home and the parent are the stimulus that's also in the mix
right.
there. So that may be helpful for you too, to just have somebody else be
Uh-huh.
responsible for that stressful part of it. I mean, it's
I
still,
think so because I mean, my husband still has a pretty rough time, but any outside person seems to get such a better response from him. And I know that it's because I spend so much time with him and that we are butting heads and we do have like this emotional kind of war going on between us every day. So every day I'm working on being a peaceful parent and he's working on, the issues that he's working on. So
yeah.
I just, yeah, at this point, I'm like, I'm throwing my hands up. I need help. I need to talk to somebody about it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, we can chat either after this or we can set up a consult and I think that it sounds like you're at a time to definitely work on it for sure.
Okay. Do you have everybody's email or my email on through
I-
this somehow, or?
I don't, but I bet that I can get that.
I was just gonna ask, Brandy, did you register?
Yeah.
Okay, then I have it and I'll send it to Lisa right now.
Okay.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds great.
Okay. Well, I guess just send me some information or an email or something, and we'll start to figure this out.
I will, for sure, Brandy. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Do you guys have any other questions? Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for your time. I appreciate you hanging in there.
I know, this was exciting. This was a good group.
I know. Thank you, Lisa. This was good strategy. So thank you.
Good. Yes, for sure, Alex. No problem. Good to see you. Okay, you guys. Well, have a great night, and please feel free if you just want to brainstorm. Here, I'm gonna say my email, but Addie has it too. So it's lisa@leapsandboundskids.com. And feel free to email me if you have any questions or you just want to try to work through stuff. I'm happy to see what I can do to help. All right.